Welcome back. In the second part of these videos, I want to start by just talking about some of the late 19th and early 20th century movements in portrait photography, introduce a few more photographers, and then talk in a little bit of detail about the genres that we're going to cover this semester. So I want to start by talking about the pictorialists. They didn't just do portraiture, but they're very, very important group of photographers in the way that photographic portraiture developed. In the late 19th and early 20th century, there were a group of European and American photographers who were very determined to prove that photography was art. Until this time, in the first 50 years or so of photography's existence, people were really very skeptical about its expressive possibilities. I mean, this seems a little crazy to us now. We understand how very expressive photography is. But the idea that it was made with a machine really made people think that it could not do some of the deeper things that painting could do. So this group of people were very interested in that. These people, by the way, I want to emphasize, these were wealthy Americans and Europeans, mostly men, not all men. Actually, there were a number of women that were involved, all white, and these were people who had time and money in order to explore this without worrying about making money from it. Photography was beginning to emerge as a commercial prospect, but these areas were still developing. So the first photographer I want to look at is Julia Margaret Cameron. She was a British woman who took up the camera at the late age of 49. Her daughter gave her a camera, and she got very enamored with it, and she made these wonderfully surprising photographs of people in her life, these beautiful portraits that were really inspired by a group of painters in the late 19th century. They are romantic. She takes advantage of what we now know of. She takes advantage of what were then thought of as the sort of the mistakes of the camera, shallow depth of field or motion, and really makes use of those expressively. She's a really fascinating photographer. She hung out with a lot of other important and famous people in England, including Sir John Herschel, who was one of the very important inventors of the photographic process. I love this very wise portrait of him. And a couple more by Julia Margaret Cameron. Oh, I think I've repeated one there, but that's all right. Let's take a look at a few more of the pictorialists. This was an American pictorialist, Edward Steichen, getting into the 20th century, of Auguste Rodin. And I discovered the first time I ever learned about the pictorialists that it seems like everybody who was a pictorialist photographed Rodin. He was a very famous sculptor. He had this wonderful profile. And so there are actually, I have a few different examples here. So this is by Edward Steichen, this is by Gertrude Casabir, and this is by Alvin Langdon Coburn. And notice these very, the nod to painting in all of these portraits. These photographers are really using very expressive and painterly methods when they produce their photographs. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. Now let's jump forward into the early to mid 20th century and the emergence of the picture magazine. So one of the things that becomes important is that when photography can be reproduced, especially in magazines and publications. And this is really transformative, especially for the idea of commercial portraiture, commercial and editorial portraiture. So we have these magazines, Life and Look, which heavily feature pictures, especially portraiture, and usually of celebrities. So I'm just going to show you a few examples of these celebrity portraits. This is Alfred Eisenstadt. These are all American photographers in the early to mid 20th century. This is Edith Stilwell by Cecil Beaton. We'll see another Cecil Beaton coming up. And this is by Gordon Parks, Albert Giacometti, the sculptor surrounded by his sculptures. And finally, Muhammad Ali by Yusuf Karsh. Now, in the late 20th century, the picture magazines sort of petered out. There weren't as many of the big picture magazines, but portraiture moved into sort of the new, more hip magazines, Rolling Stone, The New Yorker, and of course National Geographic, which wasn't a portrait magazine, but which had photographs from all around the world, and has photographs from all around the world. One of the most important photographers for The New Yorker was Richard Avedon. This is a photograph of the opera star Marian Anderson. Annie Leibowitz, who photographed for the Rolling Stone, and we'll look at some of her work later. She's still making photographs today. This is a really wonderful early portrait of Whoopi Goldberg in a tub of milk, very famous. And of course, Steve McCurry, who is very famous for portraits that he has made around the world, particularly The Girl with the Green Shawl in Afghanistan from 2002. And contemporary photographers, many of the photographers we just looked at are still making photographs, but I wanted to share with you a few that are really very important right now. Katie Grannon, who is now the primary photographer at The New Yorker since the death of Avedon. This is a beautiful portrait by Toni Morrison. Platon, who goes by one name and does these really interesting close-up photographs of celebrities. This is a great, really amazing portrait of Prince. And Dawud Bey, an African-American portrait artist who made this rather fragile and melancholy photograph of Barack Obama in 2014. And we're going to look at Dawud Bey again later, and most of these photographers later in the semester. So categories. It's always complicated when we start to categorize things. So in portraiture, of course, you know, we have commercial portraiture, which people are doing for advertising. There's also commercial portraits made for commercial purposes. We also have, of course, retail, which would be individual portraits and weddings and things like that. Editorial, which would go into magazines, and fine art, which goes into galleries. But rather than separating those out in this course by those areas, because really the look of the photograph is not necessarily determined by its purpose, I want to talk about instead these genres of how photographic portraits are made, their style, their approach, and we're going to break it down that way. So let me just talk about that a little bit. We're going to start by looking at traditional portraiture. Traditional photographic portraits, which really come out of traditional painting portraits, focus on the face and the head, and everything else is really simplified. And you can see that if we look at 19th century Julia Margaret Cameron, very early portraiture, even though it's quite a different thing from this Platon photograph of Prince, the similarity is its simplicity and its focus on face and expression and personality through the face. The next kind of portraiture that we're going to look at in practice is glamour portrait. And this is most often done, this is a star photography. However, there's a very, very important aspect of glamour photography that comes up in retail, in wedding photography and portrait photography. People really wanting to look idealized, and that's what glamour is all about. So we have a photograph of Scarlett Johansson on the left by Annie Leibowitz, very contemporary, and then this early portrait of Julie Andrews by Cecil Beaton on the right. Environmental. This is really an interesting and complicated and important area of portraiture, that is making a portrait of someone within a specific environment, not necessarily outside, but within a room or a context. The Gordon Parks portrait of Giacometti falls into this category, surrounding the artist in his studio with his portraits. And I also think that this Annie Leibowitz of Whoopi Goldberg is a kind of an environmental portrait. Instead of just taking her face, she places her in a bathtub of milk, which is this ironic environmental portraiture. Expressive, conceptual, and by the way, I'm showing you just a couple of photographers in each of these areas, and these are huge areas. I'm going to show you lots more artists as we go through the semester, and I also encourage you to spend some time looking up artists and finding portrait artists that you're interested in as well. It's very hard to cover the range of possibilities in a quick slide presentation. But on the left we have Jill Greenberg. She's a contemporary artist who is absolutely fascinating. She makes these very strange, very highly developed photographs of children in distress, and they're a little creepy. They're a little strange, and they're very expressive and conceptual. On the right, I have Hendrik Kirsten's portrait. He does these wonderful, beautifully lit portraits that look like Dutch paintings, early Dutch paintings, but are actually contemporary. And if you look at them closely, you see that people are holding things like iPads, and their headdresses are made out of cords or toilet paper rolls or doilies. So there's a lot of humor and concept in his portraits. And finally, Candid. Candid portraits will do this towards the end of the semester, surprisingly. Candid portraits are actually quite challenging, and by candid we mean that we are making portraits of people without pre-planning in their environment. So it's different from an environmental portrait, which is planned. A candid portrait is meeting people where they are and making these portraits on the fly. Often people in these portraits are more anonymous. Steve McCurry, of course, very famously made these series of portraits of a young woman in Afghanistan, but she wasn't really identified at the time. Katie Grannon on the right did a series of people on the streets, which she did in these very specific kind of harsh light against backgrounds. Again, they were anonymous, but they were portraits. They were candid portraits. Okay, and that is the end of this slideshow. Hopefully that gives you some things to think about as we move forward into the class.